Hi, everyone. Good to see you all. This is quite a different venue from last year's budget press conference, isn't it? I don't think any of us had any idea what we would be going through. So I'm going to give an overview of the budget, uh, and it'll take maybe about 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. Michael Gormany, the budget officer and acting controller, I think can help with any questions that I might not be able to answer. Um, and as with most things budget, it's a little bit complicated. I'm going to share my screen here because I have a couple of slides that I want folks to see. How's that look? Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay. Good. Um, so as folks know, as required by the charter, today I'm required to submit the fiscal year 21-22 budget to the Board of Alders. And I wanted to remind people of last year's budget and the challenges that we faced last year. As we put together last year's budget, we had a $45 million deficit just to do things as we were currently doing them. And we ended up closing that deficit with a combination of a tax increase and significant cuts to programs and significant cuts to vacant positions. In the end, after the Board of Alders approved the budget, over 100 positions were cut in the budget, along with a number of different programs, and there was a small tax increase. So last year was a very, very difficult year, and we had already cut significantly. Now, this year's budget, when we started putting it together, we had an even worse deficit that we were looking at from the projected revenues and expenses. And so, as you can imagine, this was even more challenging because last year we had made significant cuts. There were a number of things that were driving this $66 million deficit. And I'm going to go over the primary ones right now. On the revenue side, we looked at a decrease in the projected building permit revenues, parking meter collections, and parking ticket and tag collections, in addition to some other revenue reductions, but the primary ones were around building permit and parking meter and parking ticket collections. The building permit revenue is primarily reduced because the Neuroscience Center for 2 years significantly increased our building permit revenue. So the last 2 fiscal years. And because we were not seeing that revenue come in fiscal year 21-22, it meant that there was a significant drop in those revenues. Otherwise, remarkably, through COVID-19, we've seen building permit revenues steady. But since there was that 2-year bump in our building permit revenues, we had to adjust this year to about a $7 or $8 million reduction in building permit revenues. That's unrelated to COVID-19. Parking meter and parking tag and ticket revenue is related to COVID-19. We've obviously seen a significant drop in the number of people parking downtown, and that's impacted our revenue both in our current fiscal year 2021, and in our projections for next year. On the expense side, which is the main driver of the $66 million deficit, we are anticipating fixed costs increasing, employee salaries, healthcare, workers' comp, public safety salaries, and in addition, debt service and pension increases in cost. The primary increase is in pensions there, and that's driven by a number of things. First, the police and fire contracts were settled in late 2019, and those contracts impacted the long-term projected costs of the pensions because there were salary increases. And second, because our actuaries advised us to reduce our investment rate of return. And take a more responsible approach to what our anticipated investment rate of return was. Both pensions voted to reduce the investment rate of return from 7.75 to 7.25%. And that drove the pension cost to quite significantly increase, which contributed to that $66 million gap. And I just have here to underscore the significant jumps in pension, a graph of the annual pension payments that we are making to our pension funds. And you can see over the past 2 decades, the required pension payments that we have made has increased dramatically over the years and become a larger percentage of our budget. And in the change from 2021 to 2022, it's a very significant increase. And so that's it's going to be obviously very difficult for us to adjust. So in looking at the $66 million gap, we find ourselves at a crossroads. And also, given the timing of our required submission to the budget, March 1st today, and the timing of other conversations that are going on with the state and Yale University, it puts us in an uncertain position where we are not sure of whether we will get significant funding from the state or the university. And so with that backdrop, while the Board of Alders will review this budget, our team has decided to present 2 separate budgets to the Board of Alders. The first budget is the crisis budget, and then the second budget is the Forward Together budget. And I'm going to go over both budgets in a moment, but wanted to underscore the reason for 2 separate budgets is because if the state and Yale University dramatically increase their funding to the city, then we will adopt the Forward Together budget, or something that is more along those lines, depending on the Board of Alders' obvious authority to amend that budget. If we do not get significant increases in funding from Yale University and the state, we'll be forced to adopt the crisis budget. 2 things that both of these budgets have is along the lines of getting our financial house better in order and righting our fiscal ship. And I already outlined one of them, which is reducing our investment rate of return for a more responsible outlook on what we're putting into our pension funds. This will help us invest more in our pension funds, which in the long term will reduce the city's overall liabilities. This is a good thing, although it's a challenging thing because it means that we have to put more every year into our pension funds. And you can see over recent years, we've slowly reduced the anticipated investment rate of return. And this year, we're taking a pretty significant jump down from 7.75 to 7.25. And then the second thing is we're reducing the amount that we borrow each year to $30 million per year. As folks that have been following this city's budgeting process know, 2 years ago, we started a 2-year capital borrowing program because when we borrow all at once for 2 years, it saves us money rather than issuing debt every year. So in reality, 2022, this fiscal year, we will be presenting a $60 million proposed capital budget to the Board of Alders, but that is over 2 years. And so that's why you're seeing here $30 million each year. The reduction in the amount of debt that we're issuing each year will allow us to reduce our debt payments every year and will help us get our debt service payments back into a more reasonable annual amount that will further enable us to save funding and allow us to put that funding into things that are important to our city. So both budgets have those 2 components in it. And I'm going to go through each budget and some details on each budget. First, the crisis budget. Again, this is if we do not get significant increase in funding from the state and Yale University. This budget includes $2.6 million in unspecified layoffs. That's a significant amount of city staff that we would need to lay off. It includes additionally, the elimination of a net of 16 vacant positions. Those vacant positions are obviously no one's in those positions, but it will mean that we cannot fill them. 7 of those positions are in the police department. 1 is in the fire department, and the remaining are in a spread of a variety of different departments. It includes flat funding of the Board of Education. As many know, there's a minimum budget requirement by the state, so we are not allowed to cut the Board of Education. But we, in the crisis budget, will flat fund it, which is effectively a cut because the Board of Education has many fixed costs that increase as well, whether that's salaries or utilities or other costs. It includes closing a senior center, a library, and a firehouse. And it includes a 7.75% tax increase. As everyone can imagine, we want to avoid this budget at all costs. But it's also very important that we're real about the consequences if we are unable to get additional funding. The city's budget crisis is one that we need to get under control and need to make very, very difficult decisions. And without a doubt, this budget will significantly negatively impact our ability to provide services to our residents and the cost to taxpayers. We do not want to pass this budget. The second is the Forward Together budget. This assumes that we will get a combination of funding from the state and the university of $53 million together. In reality, we need much more money than this. We currently can't afford a librarian in every school, a guidance counselor in every school. We want to invest in more staff to address climate change, more staff to adequately support our reentry program that allows people the caseworker support to reenter society. We want to invest in many more programs that will actually help our city thrive. So in reality, we would like to do much more than the Forward Together budget. What the Forward Together budget does is it keeps the status quo as far as city services and ensures a 0% tax increase. I want to underscore something else about this budget, that presuming we do get some reliable additional funding from the state and Yale, it doesn't just help us support this year moving forward, but if that reliable funding continues, it allows us to be sustainable and not have to year after year have these dramatic gaps between revenues and expenses. Our pension fund costs will continue to rise moderately. Our debt service costs in the near term will continue to rise moderately. But because of these structural changes, if we are able to get that support from the state and Yale, we will be able to not just muddle through, but actually get our financial challenges under control so that in the long term, we will be able to be a government that is much better positioned to provide adequate services to our residents. I am cautiously optimistic about the conversations that we're seeing at the state level and with Yale regarding our efforts to get closer to that Forward Together budget. Last week, the House at the Capitol voted in support of Senator Martin Looney's proposal to tier pilot funding. As folks know, the city's been reliant on pilot funding to reimburse us for lost revenue from nonprofits and the taxable property that, or the non-taxable property that we cannot collect revenue from. And the state of Connecticut has a system where we're very heavily reliant, and all municipalities are very heavily reliant on real estate taxes. The Senate is voting today on this proposal. the House overwhelmingly approved the proposal from Senator Looney, and we will see what the Senate does in the next several hours. If they both vote on this, it is not a done deal. We still need to go through the budget process, but if that is successful, we will effectively go from a annual pilot payment from the state of around $41 million to an additional $49 million. So from $41 million to a total of $90 million coming from the state from payment in lieu of taxes. And many other towns and cities that are struggling economically will also get a significant increase from the pilot payments. There's bipartisan support for this. There's small town and large municipality support. And we're optimistic about this conversation, about the momentum that we've seen, about some of the conversations that we've had with the governor's office. And as you can imagine, given these two pretty stark choices in budgets, that increased pilot payment will significantly help us address our budget issues, not only this year, but in coming years, presuming that payment continues to come through. And then we're having positive conversations with Yale. And while I'm not yet ready to get into details of those, I'm cautiously optimistic that the university sees that it has an important role in helping address our financial challenges, not just because it's a good thing for the city, but it's also a good thing for the university. Next steps are, of course, that the Board of Alders will have public hearings on this matter and talk in much more detail with city staff about the budget. We're, of course, open to your questions now and also in the future as we post the budget online, and you all have an opportunity to go through more of the details. We're also going to release a video to the public that kind of describes the budget. I think I just want to finish on the comment that we're really at a crossroads here. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to decide as a community. And when I say community, I don't just mean New Haven, but I mean a greater community of Connecticut and our large partners to permanently address the financial issues that the city is facing. And that effort to permanently address that doesn't just go to things like paying pensions, but it goes much more to our ability to ensure that New Haven remains a place where people have opportunities and becomes much more so a place where people have the opportunity to thrive because we are able to adequately provide resources to ensure that at this time when people are most struggling, government can play a role in allowing people the resources that they need to not just get by, but to thrive. So with that, Michael, did I miss anything important, any important details here?
No, Mayor, I think you covered everything. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions from folks? Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with the difference between the current fiscal year's budget and I guess the crisis budget, the so-called crisis budget that you presented. Just looking at the total general fund numbers, it looks like the crisis fund is still 3.7% larger, or looks like, if I'm doing the math right, around $22 million larger than the current fiscal year's. I know there are a lot of details in the book itself, but maybe either Mayor or Director Gormany, could you go through why would the budget, what's kind of driving the increase to the overall budget, even in the crisis version? Why would that number go up? What are some of the drivers there?
I'll take a first stab at that and then Michael can add to it, but we can't choose not to fund our pensions. We can't choose not to pay debt service. We can't choose to break contractual obligations to employees as far as their salaries go. So those costs are the drivers here. The expenses are the drivers of that increase in the size of the budget. Just like people's budgets at home get more costly because the cost of utilities goes up. So even with those major cuts, we have to pay things that we're contractually obligated to pay. Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add on as far as details there.
Yeah, no, Mayor, I think, again, as you mentioned, I think really even looking at the crisis budget, Mr. Breen, that, you know, what's really driving the increase are fixed costs. And as the mayor mentioned, you know, pensions is a big driver of that. There's very little programmatic increases in the crisis budget or in the Forward Together budget. The city is really looking at fixed costs that's going up. And I think what we did as far as the crisis budget, as the mayor outlined in his presentations, was make cuts to minimize that increase that you see. But there's still an increase of about 22 million, as you pointed out, which is primarily the pensions.
Yeah, I think the pensions are around 16 to 17 million of that increase.
Thank you very much for that. It's very helpful. The so-called Forward Together budget anticipates a combined $53 million increase from Yale and the state. Is that Yale University or Yale University and Yale New Haven Hospital?
It's Yale University.
So are you asking for any kind of increase from Yale New Haven Hospital to their annual pilot?
At the moment, during a pandemic, no.
And I guess my last question for now before seeing the floor is, so Mayor, are you asking the alders to consider both of these budgets at the same time in the coming 3 months?
Correct, although obviously our very strong endorsement is for the Forward Together budget, but I think that we need to be fair in outlining what the different options are on the table. And for me to own those options, I don't want to put a large plug in a budget in the hopes that we'll get revenue. And so I think it's important for me to be very direct with the consequences if we do not get additional funding, but to outline, because of these positive conversations that are going on, the potential that we will get that funding.
Is there a date at which you think you're going to have to say, we're not getting that extra money, so alders only consider the crisis budget?
I mean, technically the date is when they approve the budget, right? That's when we need to make a decision. However, my sense is that as we move through the budget process at the state level, or as the state legislature moves through the budget process at the state level, we'll have much more certainty over the level of funding that could potentially come out of the state. And our conversations with Yale are progressing, and so we'll have presumably more certainty there as well. Can we switch to Mark, and Tom, we can come back to you if you have more questions. And then Kyle, did you raise your hand too? Okay, so let's go to Mark and then Kyle.
Thank you. Mayor, Yale University has a $4.278 billion annual budget. It's about 7 times the size of the city's annual budget, and I'm sure that they don't feel inclined to give it all to New Haven, but you didn't say much about what it is you're hoping to get from them. And I understand, basically I wanted to see if you can say any more about what you're hoping to see from them.
I'd love to give you more, but at this point, I don't want to get into the details. I think I've been quite clear over the past year and a half that I have high expectations for the university. I'm on the phone with Peter Salovey weekly, if not more, and we're having active conversations.
Okay, and have you ever, you talked about under the crisis budget, closing some things. When you talk about senior centers and libraries, do you know which senior centers or libraries would be likely to take the hit?
I do. The East Shore Senior Center, Mitchell Library, and the Whitney Avenue Fire Station. And there are different reasons for each one. East Shore, the senior center, is the most underutilized of all of them. Mitchell Library provides the most cost savings, and Whitney Avenue Fire Station it provides the least impact to public safety. None of these, and let's just be clear, we do not want to raise taxes by that amount. We do not want to close these services. These are vital to our community. We do not want to lay off people, but we have to make these difficult decisions if we do not get the support from our partners.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kyle.
Hi, Mayor. We were just trying to go over the pilot program and the vote for that's expected today. So could you just talk about, obviously we want your impact, your reaction, impact if that's passed, but also what those numbers are, because on page 64 of your budget, it looks like under Forward Together, you're looking for 53 million additional from Yale and the state, but it says if the pilot's approved. Can you just go over that again?
Sure, and it's a little bit, the state's legislative process is one that I still don't quite understand. I'd have to be honest. So the state, if the state House and Senate, or the state House have voted to approve the tiered pilot, if the Senate votes to approve it, and the through the legislative process, the budget for that is fully funded, it would mean that cities or New Haven would get an additional $49 million. New Haven is one of a number of cities that are in the 50% reimbursement category in the tiered pilot proposal. There are other municipalities that are in the 40% level, and then there are other municipalities, all the remaining municipalities are in the 30% reimbursement level. And those different percentages are basically based on need of the municipality. So the new formula takes into account need. The old formula just took into account the percentage of property in a municipality that was non-taxable. And so the question for us is, if the Senate approves it today, will the legislature actually follow through with the full funding of that tiered program? If they do so, then the city of New Haven would get an additional $49 million. We hope they do not, but it's possible they could reduce the amount of funding. And so that's where that uncertainty is. And the $53 million number, very frankly, is the gap that we needed to put in there to keep things going as they are. Our strong hope, and my strong hope, is that we get even more funding than that, because as I think anyone that lives in New Haven will acknowledge, we're not doing enough now. We do not have enough of an ability to provide the services that our residents need and deserve now. And so Forward Together does what we're doing now, continues to do what we're doing now. Our strong hope is that that $53 million ends up being much more than $53 million.
Okay, so the 53 million is what you're hoping comes from Yale and the state, and then the additional 49 would come if it's fully funded under the legislature, if the Senate passes it.
No, so I can understand why it's confusing, because there's a separate line item in there that is for pilot. Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a line item in the budget that says that we will get $41 million from pilot. It may be broken into colleges and hospitals and state property. Is that right, Michael?
So correct, Mayor. So right now, what the mayor is talking about is we normally get $41 million between state property and college and hospital now. Excuse me. That additional line that you see in the budget for the state and Yale would be if tiered pilot were to happen, then that's the additional funding, as the mayor just talked about, on top of that $41 million that we see. So that's the hope with the state, as the mayor mentioned earlier, is that we receive at minimum 41 million, and we would hope to receive on top of that around $49 million, which would plug that budgetary number, most of that budgetary number of $53 million.
So maybe another way to put it is the $53 million line item captures the uncertainty over the additional revenue that we will get. We're certain we're going to get the $41 million, and that's in a different part of the budget. The 53 is the uncertainty given the conversation with the state and Yale about additional money that we may get. Does that make sense?
Yeah, okay. And I know you just mentioned it about the library and the fire department. What would that mean as far as services if you had to cut that fire department? How would that impact response?
I would defer to the chief of the fire department to talk in detail on that. There has been in the past, maybe about 8 years ago, this was explored historically at Whitney Avenue, the closure of Whitney Avenue Fire Station and the switch over to ALS only on that site was explored in the past. I don't want to get into the specific details, mostly because I don't want to speak out of turn and give wrong information. But if there were a firehouse to be closed, that would be the one that has the least impact on response times in the community. Again, we do not want to do that. Going to Thomas.
Thank you, Mayor. So have talks with the university centered more around filling in the deficit or a more broad-ranging funding? Or is the priority just this sort of immediate budget crisis in terms of looking at increased funding?
My interest is in not just addressing some short-term issue, of thinking about the relationship in a bigger way.
Okay, thank you. And can you say any more about the 7 positions in the police department, where those cuts are coming from?
It's a little bit more complicated. Michael, maybe you can go through it. So it's a 7 net positions because we've added some sergeant positions, but reduced some officer positions that are more than the number that we've added. So it's a net.
Correct. So the net number of 7 comes from working with the police department and trying to have as least minimal impact as possible. We took a look at the number of vacancies that the police department currently has in their budget. And what we ended up doing was cutting 9 officer positions within 9 vacant, let me be clear, 9 vacant officer positions. But for continuity purposes and more efficiencies, we did end up adding 2 sergeant positions within that budget. So that's where the net number of 7 comes is. We cut 9 officers, but added 2 sergeants in the crisis budget.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. Michael, Cassandra put a comment or a question in the do you want to just ask it?
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much, Cassandra at WSHU. We were talking about expecting potentially $50,000 more dollars, but it looks like the from the state, but the Forward Together budget accounts for maybe 17 million more. Can you just clarify the numbers so we can confirm that?
Michael, can you take a look at that?
Sure, I'm just pulling it up right now so I can see exactly what.
I think probably one of the issues there, Cassandra, is that the number you're looking at includes not just general funds, but capital funds and special funds. And so the special funds are like grants that we receive. And so if we're anticipating to receive less funding in grants or more funding in grants, it kind of changes. It's directly tied to whatever the additional money we receive is directly tied to the additional services. So it kind of nets out. And with capital
Okay.
funds, there's a reduction in the amount that we're issuing in debt so that we're not spending as much on capital funds. But Michael, maybe you could weigh in a little bit here. I don't know if
No, that's it. That's exactly it, Mayor Cassandra. You are looking at the overall budget, and the real difference again is between the crisis and the forward together budget, as the mayor mentioned earlier. It's really the crisis budget really cuts the amount of services and adds in what the mayor had mentioned in his presentation earlier, as opposed to the forward together budget. Really maintains a lot of the city services at their current levels. But the number that you're mentioning in the chat is really the all-in budget between our operating budget, our general fund, our capital budget, and our special revenue funds are the grants that we are anticipating to receive in the fiscal year. So that's what you see on page 47 is sort of like an all-in budget for the city.
Thanks.
Tom.
Thanks very much for coming back to me. And I'm sorry if I missed this earlier, but could you clarify both pension funds, both SURF and PNF, you're proposing, or the boards have already voted to reduce the estimated rate of return to 7.25, or is it different depending on the fund?
Both pension funds voted, was it last week, Michael? It feels like an eternity ago.
Yes, it was last week.
Nice. Both pension funds voted to move the investment rate of return from 7.75 to 7.25.
Okay, thank you. And then last question is, there's a part of the budget that I think it's different for crisis and forward together about sale of city assets. I think one that's something like 4.5 million and the other is 1 million. What are the city assets that the city might sell?
So on the table is the potential, and we need to have more conversations on this, but to sell a school building. If we did close the Whitney Avenue Fire Station, we could potentially sell that building as well. So this item is not finalized, but we would anticipate selling some assets that would have become available.
And when you say a school, do you mean the former Strong School on Grand Avenue, or are you talking about a school that's currently a school?
I think there's a number of options on the table. The Strong School on Grand Avenue is not one on the list, but Quinnipiac School is an option. The Strong School, the former Strong School on Legion is another potential option, but that's not finalized. We need more conversations on that.
Thank you.
Anything else? Thomas, you still have your hand raised. Is that a new hand?
Yes, sorry, Mayor.
No problem.
So I just had a clarification question that I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer. So if the additional 49 million is achieved from the pilot funding, does that mean the 4 million left to meet the 53 million would be the total you're asking from the university? Or is the breakdown there more complex in terms of what the university is expected to fill in?
Let's be clear. We should not back into a number and speculate what our conversations with the university are about. The $53 million number was a number we backed into to represent what funding we would need to continue operating services as usual. And also to acknowledge the fact that we very well might not get $49 million additional from the state. And so my hope is that we, again, get much more money than that $53 million because we very much need that money. But in no way should anyone interpret that dollar amount as any sort of specific expectation on or representation of on the university's potential contribution to the city.
All right, thank you for coming back to me.
Of course. Anything else before we go?